This is John Florescu. I'm in Bucharest right now, and I welcome Charlie Cook. Charlie Cook, as most people know, is editor of the Cook Report. And I was reading a very nice review of the Cook Report. So it says, when it comes to politics, Charlie Cook has the prophecy market cornered. So that was from the Washington Post a few years ago. I hope that doesn't embarrass you too much, Charlie. And Charlie is in Maine. Welcome.
Hey, John. This is, we're hiding here. I said, if I'm going to be stuck, shut in, I want a place with a nice view and lobster at $4.99 a pound. So, but anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. I've known John and Jim for a million years from previous lives. So I'm glad to see both of you guys, and it's an honor to be with all of you.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Well, let me start out with an obvious question you may have heard in the last 2 days, or at least recently. 22 days to go. What do you see?
Well, usually people say, you didn't fall into the trap, John. Usually people say, well, it's 22 days till the election. I say, well, no, actually the election started about 2 or 3 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, I guess, when North Carolina started mailing out ballots. We've had 9.3 million people have already voted. And in some states that keep track of this, they've had as much as 20% of the total 2016 vote already cast. So I think we're headed for a record turnout, and we've got people voting earlier than ever before. And it's going to change the dynamics of the race because, once you vote, you're voted, and every day goes by that the president's 10 points on average ahead, behind Joe Biden. The incline just gets steeper and steeper and steeper.
And of the big industrial states, there is Biden holding his lead?
Yeah, it's the way I look at it is there's the sort of the generally accepted big six battleground states. So it's Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, the Frost Belt, and then the Sun Belt, Arizona, Florida, North Carolina. Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, they're the states that effectively decided the election last time. Michigan, that had gone Democratic 6 times in a row, went to Trump by 0.2 percentage point. Pennsylvania had gone 6 times in a row Democratic as well, 0.7 point. And then Wisconsin had gone Democratic. Actually, the other 2 were 6 in a row. Wisconsin was 7 times in a row, and it was also 0.7 point. But those are the 3 that determine the presidency. Right now, Biden is ahead by 4 to 8 points in each one of those. Then he's got a smaller lead, maybe 3-ish in Arizona. And then Florida, North Carolina are very, very close. And one that's not in the traditional 6 battleground states that used to be a long time ago, but is now kind of coming back in, is Ohio, where Biden actually has a very small lead there. All of these 6, Biden has to win, well, all the 7 that I mentioned. Trump has to win all of them, basically. And that's going to be a tall order.
Yeah, I would think so. Just to remind everybody, what's the margin of error not in your polling, because yours is almost, yours prophesized correctly, but generally speaking, in all these polls that we see, what's the margin of error?
Well, if you had for 1,000 sample poll, and that is a little bit bigger, I'd say the ones you see now, CNN, NBC, Wall Street Journal, whatever, they vary from 800 to 1,000. At 1,000, it's a margin of error about 3 percentage points. But just as a frame of reference, if you did a poll, you wouldn't want to do a poll with just 100 people, but with 100 people, it has a margin of error of 10, plus or minus 10. But that does raise a point. There is a perception out there that in 2016, the polls were all wrong, and that the polls told us that Hillary Clinton was going to win. And I'll challenge anyone to find me a national poll that said that Hillary Clinton would win the Electoral College.
That's interesting.
Because there isn't one, because that's not what they do. They attempt to do the national popular vote. And if you woke up on election day, 2016, and you looked at realclearpolitics.com, which is sort of the broadest of the averages out there, you would have seen that Hillary Clinton was ahead 47 to 44, 47, 44. And when all the votes were cast, Hillary Clinton got 48 and Donald Trump 46. So from the average of the polls to final, Hillary from 47 to 48 and Trump from 44 to 46. That's actually pretty good in my book. But people have got, I think they've conflated the Electoral College with the popular vote, and that for a long time, no matter how close the race was, the popular vote and Electoral College all seemed to go, the same direction. I mean, we'd only had one in 1876 and the next in 1888. It went 102 years till 2000 before we had another inversion. But even that one, Al Gore did win the popular vote, but it was by a 0.5 percentage point, a little over 500,000 votes nationwide. And then Bush ended up winning the Electoral College based on Florida, 537 votes there, that goes to the Supreme Court on a 5-4 decision. But so it was technically an inversion, but just barely. And people just looked at that and thought, well, it was kind of a statistical fluke. And then 2004, we had another really close election, George W. Bush, John Kerry, but the Electoral College and the popular vote both went the same way. And it wasn't until election night 2016 that we realized that because voting patterns had changed and the whole world had changed, that, as for the rest of you may not know, once you win a state, and we'll put Maine and Nebraska aside, but for 48 states and the District of Columbia, once you win a state by one vote, every vote you get above that's wasted. You don't get bonus electoral votes for running up the score. So when Hillary Clinton wins California by a 4.3 million vote margin, basically it's 4.3 million minus one vote are wasted. Or New York State with 1.7 million, or Illinois with 950,000 votes. But conversely, Republicans, they win their big percentage states, are generally small, medium-sized states, and the big states they win generally are by smaller percentages. So the Republican vote is more efficiently allocated. Therefore, a Democrat probably needs to win by 3 or 4 percentage points nationally before they could probably start getting comfortable, that they would also win the Electoral College.
Okay. That's a fascinating distinction. I mean, speaking of identity politics or constituencies, I see that Trump is reaching out to people of color. He had a event the other night at the White House. What do you think he's trying to do? Does he actually think he can draw black voters, or also in the case of Latinos, is he trying to appeal to sort of a kind of a new generation Latino that sees himself differently? What's the thinking behind there?
Well, when you looked at the Democratic convention, when I did, I saw a convention that was incredibly research driven, that clearly they knew their polls and their focus groups told them who they wanted to target with what kind of message. Donald Trump and his campaign don't work that way. It's just pure his instinct. And what he does not relate in any way with what professional Republican campaign professionals would recommend, would advise. And most of them, most of the mainstream ones are not in his White House. They're not in his campaign, and he's not asking them for advice. And, but I think he does things by whim more than anything else. But, people, there's this feeling that, well, he had this secret ability because he surprised everybody last time, he can do it again. But I think that point sort of ignores that Hillary Clinton had at least as much to do with the outcome of that election as Donald Trump did. And, you had a race that was between the two most disliked nominees in their respective parties' modern history. And one of them was going to win no matter what. But I don't think there's any rhyme or reason to it. The president gets, hammered, the African-American vote goes basically 90-10 Democratic. And if he did nothing but campaign among African-Americans, that wouldn't change. And if he completely ignored them, it wouldn't change. Although a lot of times what you might do is he might do some of this maybe to show to moderate white, suburban white voters, see, I'm not, I'm not a racist. So it's sort of playing that card. Latinos a little different. They've never been as African-American, as staunchly as staunchly Democrat as African-Americans, but it matters a whole lot what their national origin or their ancestors, where, Cuban Americans were very, very Republican, Puerto Ricans extremely Democratic, Mexican Americans pretty Democratic, but not as much as Puerto Ricans. And then more recently in Florida, you've got a lot of Venezuelans coming in, and they tilt more Republican.
I see. Now, last night I saw an interview with, I think, the executive director of Rock the Vote, which is always trying to get young people to vote. How do you think they're going to view this election with two senior citizens, I guess we'd have to call them?
When in 2018, you will hear a lot of people say, we had record high turnout for a midterm election among young people. Mm-hmm. And without being too snarky, if 10 voted, it would have been a record high, because young people in the United States anyway have never voted in numbers comparable to their size compared to other age groups, other demographic groups. They've always underperformed, and they undervoted in the first election that I could vote in 1972, when 18-year-olds first got the right to vote. They didn't turn out in big numbers then, and they haven't in any election since then. I think more will participate in this election than in the past, but then again, I think, I think every demographic group will turn out in bigger numbers than before. But we keep waiting for young people to start voting at high numbers, but really until you get to the age where you know where you're going to live, for a while anyway, you buy a house, maybe you have kids and worry about property values, and have kids and worry about schools and have a stake in the community. That's when people start voting. And it doesn't matter what generation you are. People under 30 or 35 have just never voted in strong numbers, but hopefully they will more this time.
You gave an interesting and clear picture on how the big states are split. How about one question, the undecided? How big right now in these 3 weeks is the undecided?
It varies from poll to poll, but good pollsters are getting about 3 or 4%. That's it. So Biden is now averaging about 52, 53% in the higher quality polls, the polls with live real people calling real people, not the robo polls. And much of the online polling is not very good, to be perfectly honest. There are some. Pew Research Center, for example, just released a poll last week that was almost 11,000 registered voters, enormous sample. And it had it at 10 points. What was I going to say? Biden is generally around 52. Trump about 10 back, about 3% going to third-party candidates, and roughly 3-4 in well-screened polls undecided.
So if the whole undecided went for Trump, it still wouldn't save him.
No. And you raise an interesting point, though, that when I talked a little bit about Hillary Clinton had the highest unfavorables of any Democrat in the history of polling, as did Donald Trump, the highest of any Republican. You actually had 20%, roughly 20% of the electorate dislike both of them. Yeah. And you wonder. In fact, there was a name. The Trump campaign came up with a nickname for that group called the Haters, because they hated both candidates. And now, of the 20% or so that dislike both candidates, what do you think they might do? Maybe not vote, or maybe vote for third-party candidates, or maybe split down the middle. But they went for Trump at the end. They were the late deciders. They went for Trump by a 19-point margin in 2016, which which is kind of an interesting thing. I think of the actress Mae West, who once said, if given the choice between two evils, I'll always take the one I've never tried. And I think those haters went with the candidate that they've never tried anyone like that before.
Speaking of a new face, Kamala Harris was there this week, in those debates, and not that they were up to much competition from the previous debate, but I thought she did remarkably well. What effect will she have, do you think, on the votes, or does it matter particularly?
Yeah, I would argue that the running mate that affected the outcome of an election was 60 years ago, when John Kennedy picked Lyndon Johnson, and the ticket carried Johnson's Texas by 1 point, less than a point. I think people vote for president, not for vice president, and particularly an election with Donald Trump. I don't even think this election is much about Joe Biden, to be perfectly honest. It's a referendum up or down on Trump. What I think is interesting about Kamala Harris, though, is I watched her a lot during the primaries in Iowa, New Hampshire, around. She is much better now than she was then.
Yeah.
And from the unveiling, she projected a warmth that she did not back during the primaries, and which I thought was interesting. But no, I think she's done a nice job. But this election is not about Kamala Harris. It's not about Mike Pence, and really, it's not really much about Joe Biden. When you have an incumbent, when you have two non-incumbents, it's a choice election, choice between two people. But when it's an incumbent, it's a referendum up or down on that incumbent. And President Trump was very, very, very vulnerable on that basis prior to the pandemic. His handling of the pandemic hurt him badly. The loss of the economy, which was sort of the most compelling reason to vote for him, really hurt. And then with that debate performance, it was like the trap door opened, down he went. And, when I talk to Republican campaign consultants, they draw comparisons with the Reagan landslide over Carter, or references to a midterm election, to the 1974 Watergate election. As far as they're concerned, this is an unmitigated disaster since the debate. Ed Rollins was quoted as saying it's over. And this was, Ronald Reagan's 1984 campaign manager and heads up a pro-Trump super PAC. He said it was over. Ted Cruz said that it could be as bad as Watergate, the Watergate election. This thing, there is a greater chance that Biden will win in a landslide than there is now of Trump making a comeback and winning the Electoral College. And to be honest, I think right now, this election is really more about the U.S. Senate, is control of the Senate, because that is teetering right on the edge. And the worse President Trump is doing, the more it sort of nudges the Senate over towards flipping.
That interesting there. You mentioned the thing about it's already decided to some extent, but no one likes to hear that in politics, because everybody wants everybody to vote. But if it is a landslide or close to a landslide, how seriously do you take Trump on his threats to question the outcome?
Well, let's just do two scenarios. One scenario, right now the president's averaging, let's go with the conservative side, 10-point lead. If he cut it in half and lost by 5, he can say whatever he wants to say and it won't matter, because that's not particularly close. And, that's not an election that could be disputed with a straight face. Not that he wouldn't, but he couldn't. But if it was, in Bush-Gore territory, really, really, really close, then that's a completely different story. And if we were to have Bush Gore, as horrible as that experience was, where half the country was going to feel like the election was stolen, and the only question was which half was going to think the election was stolen. But if it is absolutely true that there are a lot more. I mean, our judiciary historically has not been politicized, terribly politicized or partisan. But there are now more Republican judges than there are Democratic judges, and more Republicans on the Supreme Court. But the judiciary, they're not going to steal an election. However, if an election were, effectively tied, it's kind of like in baseball. Tie goes to the runner. If the ball and the runner get to the base at the same time, the advantage goes to the runner. I think, if this is a tie, it would go to Trump. I mean, if the election is effectively a tie and goes into the courts, if it really was that close, and then I think that would be a very different situation. But when you look how crystallized, how galvanized the electorate is right now, that they, starting with the pandemic, it was like they were turning the volume down on their TV set just a little bit as he lost credibility, just losing. And then once the debate occurred, that's when they hit the mute switch. I mean, they just don't even hear him.
And you'd mentioned there, Charlie, the thing about it would go to the courts. Does it go to the courts, or does it go to the state legislatures? If there's, I had read somewhere, maybe I misunderstood. What's the procedure? There's
all kinds of what ifs. If electors were to not go the direction they could, to get into all that, but I mean, it doesn't go initially. You have a lot of journalists with some really vivid imaginations that are coming up with all kinds of odd scenarios, and most of them are not people that cover politics for a living, but I mean, there are all kinds of 0.5%, 1%, 2% possibility circumstances. But basically, if it's a contested election, it's initially going to go to the courts before the Electoral College even meets. So just as Bush Gore would be an example of what happens, of the path it takes. Now, there are ways that it goes otherwise, but they're extremely low probability, particularly now that we're looking at the kind of leads that we're looking at now. Basically of the mainstream polls taken in the month of October, Fox had it at 9 among registered voters and 10 among likely voters. Pew Research, that 10,000 sample survey, 10 points. Quinnipiac, 10 points. ABC Post, 12 points, both with registered and likely. NBC Wall Street Journal, 14 points. CNN, 15 among registered, 16 among likely voters. This is not a competitive race.
Yeah. Do you ever think he could resign so he'd never have a loss in his record?
I think you could go broke trying to anticipate what President Trump is going to do on any given thing. And and that's what's kind of interesting to me about this election, or many of the interesting things, is how opposite, I mean, just polar opposite Joe Biden and Donald Trump are. And, not to put Biden up on a pedestal or pretend he's godlike or anything, but the first president we've ever had that's never had any government service of any kind, military, civilian, elected, appointed, hired, ever. And Joe Biden started off as a county councilman, senator for 36 years, vice president for 8. Biden, whether he's right or wrong, has a clear worldview, and there's sort of there's a underlying ideology there, where with President Trump, it's really done more by instinct than anything else. and how he handles a lot of important things, whether he's wants to debate or not, or he seems to debate with themselves whether he was really sick or not. So it's.
Well, we're gonna. I guess I'll ask you a reflective question. You've been in this game for a long time. What is the thing you regret about this 2020 contest? Looking back over all these contests you've watched in minute detail, if you think back of the 2020 election, what's the thing that kind of you regret about it?
Well, I regret the state of American politics today, but that's not unique to 2020. That we've created, when you and Jim and I were in the business, you had this was the Democratic Party was left of center and the Republican Party was right of center, but there was a fairly substantial overlap with conservative Democrats, moderate Democrats that sort of kept the Democratic Party from going off into a ditch on the left, and liberal moderate Republicans that kept the Republican Party from going off into a ditch on the right. But since then, the parties have become ideologically sorted. And so now we have a liberal party and a conservative party. And we've created these ideological silos among voters that rather than the idea of a trusted news source is someone who is going to tell me what I want to hear. And whether it's on the left or on the right. And I think a lot of really good people that are not going into public life now. And so I really, really regret that. But, this time, what was, I think the most interesting thing to me was that Democrats, the Democratic Party, it's like 40% is Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, AOC, staunch progressives, about 40%. Big systemic fundamental change. And about 60% are liberal in varying degrees, but relatively pragmatic. Yeah. And that's why I never thought that Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren would get the nomination, because they only represent about 40% of the party. But with the 60% over here split up between Joe Biden, Mike Bloomberg, Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, and a host of other candidates, because of the weirdness of Democratic Party rules, Bernie Sanders was on the verge of winning the Democratic nomination. And the 60% over here was thought, well, wait a minute, Bernie can't win. If Bernie can win, anybody can win. They had allowed, I think they were so traumatized by 2016, by that loss, that they were petrified that they would make the wrong mistake again. And so they allowed the perfect to be the enemy of the good. And they couldn't decide until Bernie was on the verge of getting the nomination. And then they said, well, the hell with it, we'll go with Joe. And it's not that they didn't like Joe Biden. They liked him. He's a nice guy. They thought he was too old and tended to be accident prone. But when staring the prospect of Bernie Sanders as a nominee, they said, the heck with it, we're going with Joe, and pushed the other people out. And then it was over in about a week. Damnest thing I ever saw.
Very interesting. Interesting. Well, Luca, I guess we're just about 30 minutes into it, and we promise not to keep Charlie in there too long because he's got a string of other interviews to do. Right. But do you have any questions? Do you have any questions there from viewers?
Yeah, we have several questions, and the first one is from Andrew Chakatura, and maybe I will let you ask the question real quick, Andrew, because you have two questions, and then we can move on to the other participants.
Thank you, Raluca. So the question I have here is, there have been a number of analysts over the last few years who discussed a larger sort of silent majority that was coined by Nixon in the early 70s, that have swayed more heavily to Trump or more heavily GOP than in previous elections. Some have argued that this has skewed a number of polls, major national polls in more recent times. Do you know if major pollsters such as Gallup, Pew, Quinnipiac, et cetera, are utilizing newer strategies to better group in this silent majority into their data for 2020?
Well, I don't think there is a silent majority. I mean, I think, first of all, Donald Trump lost the popular vote. I mean, that's not a poll. That was a count. And by 2.1 percentage points, he lost. There's not, I mean, he had 46% of the vote. That's not a majority, at least in Louisiana public schools where I went. And he's the first, and the thing is, when Republican pollsters are getting the same thing that Democratic pollsters, which are getting the same thing as the sort of quality media pollsters, I mean, this is not different. I mean, I think there's a lot of denial out there. When people don't like what the results they see in polls, that they don't tell them what they want to hear, then it's obviously either a biased or a flawed poll. That in their mind. And so it's just, to me, it's just a form of denial. But, the numbers are the numbers. I mean, he got 46%, he only got 46% of the vote. And now we know that it's not quite as much how many votes you get, but where do you get them? And he was able successfully, I take my hat off to him, to thread the needle, winning the presidency by a margin of 78,000 votes out of 14 million cast in those 3 states and 137 million nationwide. But those are the rules. But the thing is, no, this is this silent majority. Anyway.
Doesn't fly.
Yeah.
I believe Radu Florescu had a question. I don't know, Radu, if you want to ask it directly.
Yeah, that's fine. Hi there, Charlie. I just happen to be John's brother too, just in case you wanted the last name match. Charlie, there was a report. We do a lot of work here, and I'm active in Democrats Abroad and getting out the vote. And we've had a couple of conferences with with people from the U.S. And one of the reports that came out was that there was one statistic that came out. They talked about the white working women, educated women, et cetera, et cetera. But one statistic that stuck out of all that said that 18% of GOP voters have left the party since 2016. Now, to me, that would mean the sort of kiss of death. If you look at the poll, especially if you take into account the poll numbers that you've been talking about. I just don't know if you've had any sort of heard similar stories or.
First of all, I've never heard that statistic, and it's not one that's commonly around. And I don't know which count. What I mean, in all likelihood, well, it probably came from a poll, but which one? I have to take a look at it. There has not been a 16-point decline in National Party ID. You could look at Gallup, for example, and just watch. They do every quarter. They usually they release their party identification numbers, and it gets into, do you push the independents who lean one way or the other? There are all different ways of counting it, but there is not. There had not been a decline in Republican Party identification of any significance over the last 4 years. We've seen some signs in the last, since the last debate, we're seeing some signs of a little bit of erosion in Republican Party ID, maybe, but you have to see, to make a statement like party identification is changing. It requires like a whole lot of data to do that. And I've been reading this 10,000 sample poll that Pew just did, and I haven't come across anything that suggested a decline in party ID. So, but I mean, the thing is that there are Republicans that don't, I mean, that the president averages a 90% approval rating among Republicans. Now, obviously, if someone doesn't consider themselves a Republican anymore because of him, then they're not in that 100% of Republicans that are surveyed. But there is a slice of Republicans who don't particularly like President Trump and who don't like his style. They don't like his tweeting. They don't like his leadership style. But they do like where the economy had been. They do like their tax cuts. They do like their less regulation, and they do like their conservative judges. And most of those have sort of hung in there with him, even though they don't care for him personally. But obviously some didn't. But I've seen no noticeable downward trend in Republican ID.
We have another couple of questions from Eugene Bold. He's in Florida. Eugene, if you want to go ahead and ask your question.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you, Mr. Cook, for being part of this. So my name is Eugene Bold. I'm of Romanian descent, and I'm also relatively active in the South Florida Democratic Party. But I have a question because, and this kind of pertains to not just Romanians, but usually ethnic groups of immigrants that came from countries that were communist or socialist, where they've had some sort of a history with socialism or communism. And oftentimes when, for example, within my community here locally, when I tell them that I'm, part of the Democratic Party, or that I volunteer with the Democratic Party, I often get the stare and, a very judgmental look. And I think that's attributable to a perception, especially recently, that somehow the Democratic Party has been shifting towards a hard left, where, as you were saying earlier, your Bernie Sanders, your AOCs, they kind of grabbed the microphone and they're setting the agenda and the priorities. And it's hard to fight against that. And I'm really not sure what can the Democrats do from your perspective to kind of reclaim their position, where the reality where, we have 60% that are moderates and maybe the 40% that are, hard left. So what can we do to kind of regain that, the microphones and the ability to kind of to speak our own truth versus, the truth that's being,
I think you're making an excellent point, and I've heard it suggested or the question asked, why doesn't Biden just go to South Florida and give a speech on attacking Russia and Putin and establishing his anti-Russia credentials in a place where people, to kind of underscore that all Democrats are not, far left, all that, but also to point out to people that are staunchly anti-communist that President Trump's record is not exactly one of consistency, or actually it has been, but somewhat different from what they might think.
Right.
So I don't know why he doesn't do that. I mean, I don't know what the downside. I suppose there's some people on the far left that might get uncomfortable with it, but you have to break some eggs to make an omelet, and I certainly would do that. But I don't think Democrats have played the Putin card nearly as much as they should. Although it could be that could be one of the this being saved for a closing argument.
Yes, we can hear you.
Uh-oh. I thought I was on mute. No, it really wasn't a question. It was more of a statement. Earlier, you were talking about the younger generation not voting until maybe they had settled down, bought a home, that type of thing. And I have a few millennials of my own, 18-year-old who went off to college at the University of Florida, and the very first thing she wanted to do was make sure she registered to vote.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've got 3 kids in their 20s and 30s, and they all vote. But the thing is, they're not representative. I mean, the data are the data. I mean, that young people have the lowest voter participation rate of any age group by a long margin. I mean, the thing is, there just are differences differences in voter participation rate. I mean, for example, African American women vote at a much higher rate than African American men do.
Yeah.
But I mean, so yeah, we can all cite examples of young people that vote regularly, that work in campaigns, that are active in politics. Absolutely true. It always has been true. But just sort of statistically speaking, they participate at a lower rate than other people do, and it's been that way for 50 years.
And that was my question: is that maybe do you think that this year may be different because of our work with COVID? Because even the young ones have been affected, like the dorms that got shut down and the schools that got closed down. Do you think that changes anything?
I feel quite sure that participation among young people will go up this election. It's coming up from a low base, though. I mean,
Gotcha.
But yeah, that's why I was joking earlier that if, we had a record high turnout of young people in the 2018 midterm election, but then again, they virtually had not voted in previous midterm elections. So, but Donald Trump is going to bring out, he's going to bring out the Republican base. He's going to bring out the Democratic base. I mean, he just evokes very strong emotions, pro and con, that 75% of voters either strongly approve the job he's doing or strongly disapprove. There's just not much ambivalence about him at all. And I think that gets back to the point I was trying to make about 2016, where that election was as much or more about Hillary Clinton as it was Donald Trump. And that I think there's a feeling among some that he has some secret sauce, some secret recipe, some secret bonding with voters that will enable him to come back. Well, maybe he does, but it better kick in pretty quickly because a lot of people have already voted. And as I said, every day goes by, the incline of what it would take of closing this gap. And I didn't even point to one non-polling metric. What can you say? A Republican incumbent president of the United States is having fundraising problems. At one point last week, they cut their ad buy for TV in Ohio and Iowa, and they stopped doing they stopped polling suddenly to save money. That I would argue that those, number one, if you're not spending money, so that makes it even harder to close the gap if you can't go out and raise money for a while. But the second thing is that it's just a metric of if a president is popular, if a president has very strong support, generally speaking, they can raise money. And if you can't, then that suggests that there's some underlying problem there.
Sorry, before I let John wrap up, I want to remind everybody that you can sign up for more events at our website, alianza.org. Whether you're in Romania or the US, we have a sister organization in Romania as well. So please feel free to go ahead and do that. Thank you everyone for the questions and for the participation. We look forward to seeing you at next events. And I'm going to let John wrap up.
Well, I'll just wrap up very quickly with to say thank you, Charlie, for that tremendously insightful overview. And it was extremely interesting and right to the point, particularly the last point about fundraising, that metric, which no one really keeps in mind, but it's vital. Anyways, thank you all for joining. Charlie, I guess you'll be at the inaugural ball with discounted lobsters that everybody likes in the wintertime.
I've said I wouldn't go to an inauguration if my kids were getting inaugurated. It is the most overrated, horrible, the worst time of year for Washington. Wild horses couldn't drag me to one. But thank you, John. Thank you, Jim, for the invitation.
Thanks a million.
To be with you. Thank
you.
So
great. It's great. Thank you for your time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
You.